Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Al24 News Live from Algiers, and please welcome to our special and continuous live coverage of the latest regarding the Ukrainian and Russian file with my panel of guests, Abdenour Toumi, political analyst from Paris, in addition to Don McLean-Gill, geopolitical analyst and author from Philippines, who both joins us live via Skype. But before we start our discussion with our panel of guests, let's just move on to the latest regarding this thorny file. And US President Joe Biden plans to travel to Brussels next week to meet with NATO allies about bolstering support for Ukraine as it fights to fend off Russia's unprovoked attack. US President Joe Biden is reportedly set to announce an additional $800 million in aid for Ukraine, bringing the total amount of US aid to over $1 billion amid Ukraine's conflict with Russia. And we have UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson traveled to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to discuss how to boost Middle Eastern oil and gas exports and reduce purchases from Russia. The European Union on Tuesday introduced a fourth round of anti-Russian sanctions. The new measures include bans on investments in the Russian energy sector and prohibitions on export of luxury goods and imports of iron and steel. And finally, about 29,000 people were evacuated from Ukrainian cities through humanitarian corridors, most of them from the besieged city of Mariupol, a senior Ukrainian official says. Well, welcome back. And we have here lots of updates. Let's start with you, Abdenour. Do you have any comments regarding these latest updates that we have just read?
Good afternoon, Madam. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon to your guests and good afternoon also to your viewers. Just a quick note. I mean, my affiliation also is I am affiliated with ORSAM. It's Middle East Center Studies, a Turkish think tank based in Ankara. And I am Maghreb Studies expert. On this form, however, the news are going very fast, and we just heard about, I think an hour ago, the statement of the Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov, who stated that it could be looking for neutrality status for Ukraine. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have declined that possibility. So, there is some or a little window of hope in the horizon in the light of the latest talks between the two belligerents. And I presume that the timid meeting that took place last week on Thursday in Antalya, in Turkey, between the Russian Foreign Affairs Minister and his counterpart, the Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister, even though there weren't any, I would say, flamboyant statements and to break through, but the talks are going on, and this is a good prospect for the ongoing war. However, we saw also, on the other hand, the superpower, especially led by the US, and as you stated, President Biden is heading next week to Brussels for the extraordinary NATO meeting members. And this is the thorny issue that will maybe hold the talks directly between the two belligerents. And also we saw here in France yesterday.
Thank you, Abdenour. Let me just bring into our conversation Don from the Philippines. Here we have Abdenour says that NATO issue is a key element in these talks, in this, let's say, military invasion. Do you think that it's the only cause?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. And in line with my respective co-panelists, I agree with what he has said regarding, of course, the issue at hand vis-a-vis the talks. While Russian Foreign Minister was quite positive and optimistic about the talks, that there's some parts that are being close to agreements. He has also mentioned, of course, the proposition of a neutral status for Ukraine, which is up for serious consideration. And on that note, the Ukrainian side did not agree to such particular proposition, and that they noted that a legally verified security guarantee must be made according to Kiev's interest. However, it must be noted that also today, President Zelensky noted that peace talks with Russia were actually beginning to sound more realistic. Mm-hmm. And this is also important to note that he has also emphasized the role of negotiations. So this is absolutely important, though of course it is absolutely arduous to achieve something overnight. The direction that we are going through, despite having baby steps, is towards the right direction. And again, this could have been seriously mitigated if negotiations were in fact used beforehand. But now they're realizing the importance of negotiations. I hope that the position will be going on further, and the role of security guarantees for both sides with both individual security concerns must also be highlighted. And I feel both sides are way past that point of realization that yes, this is the case, and we need to agree upon the role of security guarantees. More sanctions, more fighting would not really solve the deal, but negotiations and peace talks would be the way forward. If not, there would be more casualties.
Well, back to you, Abdelnour. Here, Don says that, or even according to both parts, there is a sort of positivity in these talks, the latest of them. And here, what do you think are the factors, the key factors that are played on bringing this positive atmosphere to the talks? Do you think that, after all, the sanctions of the West are doing their job so far?
First of all, you are right. Actually, we all know the sanctions was, kind of just, a pressure card, by the way, to go to negotiate. And the sanctions effect, or factor, they don't have any effect. And we saw that with Cuba, with Iran, with North Korea and Iran, and so on. And President Putin knows that well. And this is why he kept pushing and using the gas card as his wild card to destabilize not only the Ukrainians, but also the West, and notably the Europeans. And yes, even though the war is still going on, and we all know, at this moment that we were speaking, Kiev is still on siege and bombed, but the negotiation process, or at least the talks, are trying to break through to find a solution toward this crisis. But the main question, what made, for instance, President Putin, and on the other hand, the NATO / the US wait all this or go through all this mess to finally go back to what they were talking about 30 years ago. And in 30 years ago, there were many things have been developed on the geopolitical level and for the domestic politics of these countries. So this is what, today it's good, and it's hopeful, again, a ray of hope for the people, especially the Ukrainians and for the Russians, because both peoples cannot afford to go for a continuous war and a permanent tensions. But on the other hand, what is going on in the mind of the, I would say, the superpower, and notably the Americans, had why they pushed President Putin to go to this, to provoke, again, the international community.
Abdelnour, here you are saying that things are going on towards a a positive way. Let me just put this into Don. How comes everything is going towards a positive way at a time when we have a huge number? We are talking now about millions of refugees leaving the country, being stuck on the borders. We have death casualties from both parts. What is the worthiness of these talks at a time when things on the ground are getting from bad to worse?
Absolutely right. And in fact, it is because of these situations that are going really bad right now for the Ukrainians, for that particular matter, we can now see a more realistic and practical approach, particularly from the side of Ukraine, to be able to, and of course Russia and NATO for that matter, to be able to mitigate the situation in order to preserve the casualties and in order to safeguard the people. As we can see, the initial stages of the conflict really banked on the persuasion for NATO to expand further and to sort of mitigate. But then, at the request of the no-fly zone, for example, NATO was also reluctant to that because they knew the consequences. If we think the consequences now are bad, imagine having a nuclear catastrophe with nuclear powers involved as well. And on top of that, with regards to the refugees, we have to understand that their situation fleeing is not, in fact, that all effective because, as we can see, the United Kingdom also has rigid policies for Ukrainian refugees. In fact, other members in the European Union are also temporarily assisting the refugees through a temporary legislation, but then it's also ambiguous.
What do you think, Don, is the UK in here is taking such a stance towards the refugee crisis? Is it learning from the from Germany, the case of Germany, and let's say the exodus of Syrian refugees and even others fleeing from war zones?
Absolutely. Just a brief answer to that. We have to understand how international politics works. The role of national interests clearly trumps that of global security. And at the end of the day, we can see how the national interest, even regarding NATO countries, prevails. They're willing to supply arms. They're willing to apply sanctions on Russia, but they're not willing to get involved directly to compromise their own soldiers as well. And in fact, we can see there is also a reluctance to be able to get involved deeply into the situation. So we can see here that the role of national interest really prevails. And the fact that, of course, expanding NATO to begin with since the 1990s was also a touchy subject. In fact, there were other major European powers like France and Germany who were once also quite reluctant to expand NATO further. So again, we have to see here that the choices of national interest and objectivity are playing a bigger role. And this is why this has led to a more practical solution, a more practical direction to engage with negotiations. Because as we can see, with the situation in hand, practicality and rationality would be the only way forward, considering that this is not a new issue and has been taking place since the 1990s, as my respected co-panelist has mentioned. So a situation and solution based on that must be made.
Well, Don, here you have spoken about objectivity and national interest, and here you have stressed on the case of Ukraine. Let me just bring the case of the United States for Abdel-Noor, and here just let's try to understand the paradox that's happening. You have the United States supporting the Ukrainians through sending, let's say, military equipment. We have financial support. At the same time, the United States doesn't want to, let's say, send its own national soldiers to fight in Ukraine. And the United States itself has pulled itself from Afghanistan in respect to the will of its people who do not want anymore to send their own, let's say, husbands, their fathers, their sons to war zones. What is this paradox that we have here? Can you explain it to us?
Actually, it's a very interesting point because it's not a paradox. It's the continuity of what was the so-called Obama doctrine. And we remember when Obama came to the White House in 2008. I mean, one of his major foreign policy and defense policy is to withdraw the troops from overseas. And we saw that development that took place and I mean slowly under the Trump administration, we saw that experience in Syria, and then later on last summer, when President Biden officially he withdrew the U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and also there were and again he is also slowly withdrawing his troops from Iraq, and because Americans, especially the public opinion, get tired of wars, and this goes back to the Vietnam War in the last century, but recently in the last 20 years, they've been in two endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also for as Professor McCann put it, there is a national interest or national politics, especially the national politics plays, and also of course it goes or rhymes with the national interest as well. So we all know the U.S. or President Biden particularly is coming for midterm elections next fall, and I think all the polls show that he will be losing the House because, again, he doesn't control the Senate, and therefore he will be named like president anyway. But the long story short, to sum up all this, why the U.S. now are, again, playing on kind of rhetoric foreign policy, and this again goes back with President Obama doctrine as well, by pushing, helping the Ukrainians, for instance, on this crisis, helping the Ukrainians and with intelligence and weapons, but don't send the troops on the ground.
Well, here you have spoken about money, and here let's just put this to Don. Don't you think, Don, that the USA Treasury is getting tired soon, since it has just pulled itself from Afghanistan, and here we're talking about billions and millions of dollars being sent to Ukraine in order to help it in this conflict. Where does all of this money come from? And don't you think that this money should be dedicated to other peaceful projects, let's say, in this case?
Right. That is in itself the paradox of having such a huge economic capacity. Now we have to understand that since the 1970s, we could see a downward trajectory of American material capability, and this we can see to be one of the reasons why the U.S. continues to be reluctant to involve itself directly in more conflicts. However, despite this, we can see that the situation in Iraq, the situation in Afghanistan, Libya, and all these countries did not refrain it from achieving its goal of spreading liberal internationalism, especially in these parts of the world. But however, these backfired significantly, and the people were very ambivalent towards this particular thing. And this is what made Trump they considered his propositions to be more effective because he wanted to focus internally, America first. And this is something that the people wanted during that particular time. And now they could see that because of these situations, especially the oil sanctions, if we get time to discuss that later on, will also be impacting the American public. And this will continue to cause more dismay towards the current administration. So we have to not only look into international politics, but the role of public opinion domestically and how it transforms domestic politics. Germany, for example, is also reluctant to join in the bandwagon of going full force on energy sanctions because it is aware of public opinion within its territory and how this could destabilize the current government. So everyone's now trying to balance, and I think being critical and calculative would be important in order to look into the situation and not to overstate or understate.
That's cool. Now, let's move to this piece of information regarding Kiev in the latest developments. A residential building in a district of Kiev partially collapsed and caught fire after multiple explosions rocked the Ukrainian capital early today. And the state emergency service that, quote, 2 residential buildings were damaged in a shelling overnight. In the central part of Kiev, 2 people were injured and 35 were evacuated. Well, back to you here, Abdel talking about Kiev now is becoming the epicenter of fight. What can we expect in the coming hours or days?
I think I'm not a military expert, but on this, following the event closely, I think it's one of President Putin's ultimate goal is to take Kiev. And the reason why, because symbolically it's very, very important, and then to push his team that is talking to their counterpart Ukrainians. And as we said, who owns the field owns the table, and then he goes to the negotiation parameter based on this by having Kiev as again not only the capital but also it's symbolic, and also he can put further pressure by pushing the West and notably the Europeans to slow down a little bit from their, I would say, the tough message and also rhetorical policies that have been taken in the last 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Here, Abdel, you said like President Putin his target is to, let's say, get over Kiev, the capital. Don, what is the scenario that we can expect if ever President Putin takes Kiev? What will happen next?
Right, thank you. And we have to understand here that when we're assessing Russia's current position in Ukraine, we can obviously say that it is also incurring losses, and particularly with regards to its economy is not doing so good. And of course, we have to understand that we have to separate the current situation from idealists, those who believe that Russia's endgame is to expand towards a former Soviet Union approach. I mean, for now, we can see that it is quite impossible for Russia to maintain and hold a vast level of territory beyond its borders because of its capacity. So what we are seeing now is that Russia is focused, of course, in taking these critical areas. As we can see, Russia has cut off the south of Ukraine from the coast. And on top of that, we have advancements in the northern areas and, of course, the eastern areas. So we can see that it is also inevitable to have a pragmatic analysis regarding Russia's capacity to take over and hold these areas for a long time. And in fact, what we can see is that Russia is also signaling at the end of the day the role of negotiations to go hand in hand. Of course, we can see that Russia has also made advancements, energy supplies, water supplies for that matter, which can serve as an impediment for the Ukrainians. And yes, there are advancements from the Russian side as well. But then again, its ability to hold these locations for a long term would be questionable, of course, and it's important not to overstate Russia's endgame here. So now we have to look into the situation. Millions of people are being displaced. Thousands of people are dying. So the need to look towards a more practical solution is necessary for the people. And if we just keep overstating the possible end games, then we would just be making our own monsters. And this is dangerous, as we have seen. Look where it has brought us here. And if we look into a situation that would benefit both sides, that would be the way to go. As we can see now, there would obviously still be tensions ongoing until the negotiations do not complete. Hopefully, the negotiations would reach a practical solution, a pragmatic solution. But till then, we are expecting more casualties, of course, which is really unfortunate. For all the lives that are being lost.
All right, so probably as I just have understood your analysis down here, let me just put this to Mr. Abdel. President, don't you think that President Putin is taking things on a slow approach in order just to push President Zelensky to back up and accept all demands of Russia? Do you agree?
Actually, from the first, I would say, week of the war, that was the one of the President Putin's ultimate goals. Actually, he wanted even regime change and to topple the government of President Zelensky. However, I mean, I will argue to the contrary. Now, President Zelensky, I mean, he's having a huge support from the West and also the public opinions and also the media, I mean, who have already, I mean, portrayed him as Winston Churchill of this time. So now there would be a new dynamic in the, I would say, in the negotiation process that is taking place now, and also the will push, maybe sure, President Zelensky to make some, I'll say, concessions toward the Russians, but I think he already started to some extent by saying we are not really interested now to join the NATO because he saw that and he found out that he's not welcomed either by the NATO members. The only thing he can also say capitalize on is keep watching or going or following the trajectory of that has been on the media toward the Western public opinion.
All right. Now let's move to the piece of talk of President of Ukraine, Zelensky, who said early on Wednesday that peace talks with Russia were beginning to sound more realistic, but that more time was needed to ensure the outcome of the negotiations if they were in Kiev's interest. Let's have a listen.
Це важливо.
It's difficult, but important, because every war ends with an agreement. The meetings continue. From what I have been told, the positions in the negotiations seem more realistic. However, more time is needed for decisions to be in Ukraine's interest.
Граждане России, любой из вас.
Citizens of Russia, all of you who have access to truthful information can already understand how this war will end for your country. In shame and poverty, years of isolation, a very cruel repressive system that will treat the citizens of Russia in the same inhumane way that you, the occupier, have treated the Ukrainians.
Относились вы, оккупанты.
Well, back to you, Dan. Here, President Zelensky says it clearly that more time is needed for negotiations. And do you think that more time, and we still have more time for this conflict to keep going with these casualties and all destruction that is happening on the ground?
Right. So we have to understand here that every second, every minute that counts is that passes rather is to the expense of the people, the innocent lives that are being lost for that matter. And we have to understand that while it is welcoming to see Ukraine effectively look into the positive outcomes for negotiations, of course the factor of time would also be of the essence given of course the situation that continues to unfold by the day. And however, again, as I have mentioned, and as President Zelensky has mentioned, agreements and negotiations are the way to go. Without such instruments, we can see that the solution would not be effective and long term. If I may add just one particular note, if you look into the situation in Afghanistan, for that matter, as we can see, the U.S. was there for 2 decades in that matter, full force military operations in Afghanistan to rid of the Taliban and all that, and the Al Qaeda for that matter. But if you saw right after the withdrawal, without a proper instrumented framework to facilitate the way forward and without providing the guarantees needed for the Afghans, the same situation happened again. The Taliban took over and at the expense of Afghan lives. This should not be the issue here. An agreement, a solid agreement with proper guarantees from both parties must be made effectively if we are to see stability in the long term. If not, then the same thing would happen again anytime soon.
Talking about stability for a long term, let me just ask Abdel-Nour. We are talking here about, let's just put this scenario here and say that, okay, we have negotiations were set, we agree. What on earth, or how on earth are we going to to deal with over 2 million people who have left their homes during such a short period of time? Is it going to be easy for them to return overnight to their homes and enjoy peace again in their own country?
This is, of course, I mean, it will be in the hands of the politicians or the leaders in, I would argue, post negotiations slash peace in Ukraine. And as again, the only, I would say, hopeful element from this is Ukraine now, as I said, for the last decade, has been experiencing kind of smooth process, democratic transition, and also they are it's still in learning process, but it's good for the new generation and also the new leaders that we saw and who are more open to the democratic process and also for more freedom, therefore trying to move from the post-Soviet era toward a new Ukraine that is on the horizon. So this is why the possibility of the so-called refugees who flee the country now, I mean, they are estimated by millions, according to the UNHCR and ECHO, the European Union organization. They can go back, but they need stability, they need security, and also because now they were, to some extent, traumatized by what happened, because they experienced the last, I would say, 10 years, some wars, but it was far from their home. It was happening in the east part, in the southeast part, but not close, I mean, to Kiev and the cities that are close to the west. And also, even a new generation, meaning by this, there is a new middle class that has emerged in the last decades, was also shocked by this war. So the return of the refugees who fled to the neighboring countries, and we saw that the European Union countries who are willing to welcome them. I mean, for instance, here in France, already they welcomed. I mean, it's not enough. I mean, it's not too much, but it's about 10,000. But according to the Interior Minister this morning, he said that his country is willing to welcome more than 100,000 in an integration and post-integration process. But this is the dilemma that the host countries will deal with, and also they are condemned to help for stability and give some uncertainty to the Ukrainians to stabilize the country. But according to what's going on, it's not going to do or to happen anytime soon, because it looks like it's already devastated. And what we need here, it's almost the EU needs.
All right, Abdel-Nour. Here you have spoken about an important point regarding democracy. And in the first test in front of President Zelensky, he got engaged. Let's say, if you just put it into between brackets, into such a conflict. I'll put this point to Don, but not now. Let's move to listen to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who declared that it must be recognized that Ukraine will not be able to join NATO, while this file is one of the reasons advanced by Russia to justify its military operation in the country.
Ukraine is not a member of NATO. We understand that. We are decent people. We have heard for years that the doors are open, but we have also heard that we cannot join. It is a truth, and it must be recognized. I'm happy that our people are starting to understand this and to rely on themselves and our partners who help us.
Again, let's move to another piece of information here, and in an economic summit organized by the German newspaper Die Welt in Berlin, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the West continues to trust in the effect of sanctions imposed on Russia. Well, if you have just well noted my point before we move to these pieces of information, Don, Abdenour said that democracy, Ukraine is trying to pave itself towards democracy, but then, as I just put this question, President Zelensky found himself in the first test launching his own country, let's say peaceful country, into a conflict. Any comments regarding this, Don?
That is right. I mean, the democratization process is ongoing in Ukraine. It seeks to integrate itself quite effectively among the democracies of the West. However, we have to understand that each country's own personal experience, in line with its history, in line with its culture, its political culture, its strategic culture, really plays significant roles in assessing the level of democratization one country has. There is, again, there are several models of democracy, and we have to understand that the situation now, for that matter, shows that it is necessary to understand states and their process towards democracy based on, of course, a dynamic perspective. Now, if we have to look into the situation, of course, the priority of every state is to defend its national borders, its territory, its people. And we have seen that those who have espoused democratic values themselves, established democracies, have deviated from liberal democratic values in preservation of realpolitik and their national interest. And they have deviated from these values to ascertain and to maintain their national interests. So we have to understand how the international system really works. And it's dangerous to say that a one-size-fits-all or one-path-fits-all it's dangerous as well. I mean, we have seen, as I've mentioned, established democracies deviating from these particular norms in order to safeguard their immediate interests, be it territory, economic resources, and of course, threat perceptions, which they consider to be threats. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that foreign policy, for that matter, continues to shift. There's a flip-flopping, as we can see, between adhering democratic values and, of course, preserving the national interest to realpolitik. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand that to be able to understand these variations.
Okay. Don, since in our discussion and this special coverage, trying to understand the democracy of, let's say, Western countries and the public opinion, economically speaking, Abdenour, how do you read the reaction of Russia here by hitting back and imposing sanctions on U.S. top officials?
I think it's a hit back to the U.S. I mean, you hit me, I hit you back. But I think Russia is not looking toward that sanctions. I would say it's not really worried because it has an alternative and is looking toward China to help on this issue. Knowing that China will be in a very, very difficult balanced position to help Russia on one hand and to look vis-a-vis the West as a credible partner also in the, I would say, in the aftermath of this crisis, because China will emerge strongly on the international system level. As Professor McLean put it, the international system, I'm sure, will be changing, and the dynamic or the parameters of this war.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abdenour. Sorry to cut you while you're talking about. Let's just put this question: how is it going to be easy to rebuild Ukraine after this war? Quickly speaking, Don.
Well, no, it would not be easy, considering that it's an ongoing issue. Hundreds of billions of dollars would be needed, of course, and before stabilizing this, before even thinking about rebuilding, I think it's necessary to think about how to stabilize the situation, and that's the issue at hand. And yes, it would be extremely difficult, and the personal perspective of people, their fears and everything, the emotional, psychological impact will be devastating and would not be able to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Don. Very special thanks as well to Abdel. You both joined us via Skype, and thank you so much for bringing all of these insights into our live coverage. That's all for today. Thank you so much for following us. Bye-bye for now.